Welcome back to Truth Talk, and we're excited to be talking about leadership from Homer's Iliad. And we have Andrew Bentley with us, and there's a lot of material in this, and I'm excited to get into it.
Fantastic.
So a little bit about the Iliad so that you understand. If you didn't hear the first 3 episodes, go back and listen. Basically, the first episode is kind of, the setup for it. The Grecian states were not autocratic in the sense of one king who rules everybody. It was city-nation states, and every city/nation state had a king. So it's really this interesting window into collectives and how to lead leaders and how to lead and not just assume that everybody's going to follow in. And so basically the whole Iliad is about, it's kind of parenthetical. The war has already been going on for 9.5 years when Agamemnon, one of the most infamous kings and leaders, who just managed to do everything wrong, right? And he gets in his deal, and he wounds and offends Achilles. Achilles is this brilliant warrior, so we are told. We haven't seen it. We've been reading hundreds of pages and thousands of lines, and Achilles hasn't really done anything but whine and pout. And he might have a reason to whine and pout. And I think he does. Do you think he does?
I think there are a set of conditions that would tempt somebody to whine and pout.
Okay. And so his whining and pouting takes a lot of energy.
Yes.
And now it's sucking up all the oxygen.
Yes.
And now even people who originally saw him as the aggrieved party or the wronged party is like, come on, dude, get over it. Which brings us to book 9, where they all get together because he is their leader. Achilles does rank above Odysseus, Diomedes, and all the rest of them. He probably only ranks beneath maybe Agamemnon and Paris. But other than that, he's very high ranking. So they get together, and the primary feature of this book is that everyone is begging Achilles, come out and fight. And so he won't do it. He's petulant. He's fallen into himself, and they're pleading with him. And basically we're leading up to book number 10, which we're not going to talk about. It's the book that people read the Homer's Iliad just for book number 10, the night raid. It is like the most amazing battle ever, right? And Achilles doesn't go to it. But this is them getting together, a group of men saying, please get over it already and come out and fight. So I'll read a few portions, but before I get into reading, do you have anything you want to just set up the book with?
No, there's just, no, and then I start talking. Yes, I guess. There are so many pieces to it. The things around that occur to me. Does Agamemnon have the moral authority to lead? Has he lost the moral authority to lead? And what does that look like? And who's the arbiter of when that actually takes place? There's an apology that comes forward, sort of a mea culpa, and it's sort of an interesting one, and there's lots there to sort of deconstruct and think about. The role of the leader in terms of being the first believer for all of these people is something that's interesting to me. We talked briefly about leading up previously, and I think there's some opportunity there to have some conversation about that. There's just a lot of little pieces and threads that we can pull on in terms of things that look good from a leadership perspective and things that don't look so good from a leadership perspective.
Right. Okay, we'll get right into it. And so one thing you can count on with Achilles and Agamemnon as well is that Agamemnon is fickle. He's mercurial. He's up and down, okay? One day he's ready to conquer. The next day he's begging everybody to go home. The book opens with them coming to hear him and him saying, if you love me, please obey me, right? So that's already, to me, a shaky ground for leadership, is sentimentality. When I'm asking you to just use sentimental emotion to follow me, I probably don't have a great plan, right? So I got to appeal to that. So he says, let's just quit this whole thing and go home, all right? To which Diomedes gives him a proper tongue lashing. I mean, and rightfully so, okay? So let me read what he says. He says, Agamemnon says, so come, follow my orders. Obey me, all you Argives. Come and run, sail home to the fatherland. We'll never take the broad streets of Troy. Silence held them all, struck dumb by his orders. A long while they said nothing, their spirits dashed. Finally, Diomedes, lord of the war cry, broke forth. I will be the first to oppose you in your folly, here in this assembly, king, where it's custom. Spare me your anger, my courage. Mine was the first you mocked. We talked about this. He said, you made me and branded me a coward, a poor soldier. Yes, well, they know all about that, the Argives young and old, and have seen your twisting ways. Okay, so then he goes and calls him a desperate man. All right, so again and again, I see this leadership principle assert itself over and over, that Agamemnon accuses Diomedes of being a turncoat, which is actually what he is. Now, this reminds me a lot of King Saul in the Bible. We tend to see in others what we know is in ourselves. And our accusations closely resemble our own weaknesses. Do you see that in Agamemnon? When he tries to lead, he does it in a way where he's projecting his own failure and faults on others. And that might be some of the tension we pick up. He's angry at them, but also angry at himself.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that, the level of achievement that he has managed in terms, and again, it's not necessarily true, but this idea of a leader that has achieved as much as he has, that there has to be some sense of awareness in him. And so he is essentially playing the reel of his own deficiencies and essentially transposing those onto Achilles or Diomedes in this particular case, right? This projection of himself on them, you see it over and over and over again. And you have to believe, at least I would have to believe, that he has enough awareness to see that in himself. It's the projection that's the sad part about that he's laying it on top of them.
Yeah. And so they're getting tired at this point,
Absolutely.
right? And it's coming to a real break in the, like, what you say is, have we passed the point of no return on this? Is he able to still lead, right? And so Nestor weighs in and says, I'm with Diomedes. And so Odysseus says, yeah, that's what he did to me. So you kind of see this groundswell of complaint, right? And at that point, is there anything Agamemnon could have done that could have kind of collected them other than what he tries to do, okay? Which is, according to book 9, he actually does apologize here.
Yeah.
And he says, okay, I'm sorry, let's get Achilles back in the game.
Yeah, and I think this brings up the piece of, has he lost the moral authority to lead? And of course, that's the sense that we get from these people, that may be the case. And then you get his apology, his mea culpa, and which he does a pretty good job of it in terms of, and I think there's a piece here that leaders all have to think about. None of us are completely infallible. Mm-hmm. And so we find ourselves having to apologize. There are times when we have to say, I didn't see that entirely correct, or, I have to, regroup on something that I've done. And I think Agamemnon does a pretty good job of his mea culpa in the sense that he says, I'm sorry. He does, I was blinded by my own passion. Like, he actually listens. If you think about a good apology has what? It says, I'm sorry. Here's specifically what I did. Here's how I believe it affected you. Here's why it happened. And lastly, here's what I'm going to do to correct that. And he sort of gets 3 out of the 5 in terms of that list. The problem is that the last piece of it is not the here's what I'm going to do. It's actually conditional, right? It's like, if in fact the gods allow me to.
Yeah.
And so it's like putting a but, right? It essentially erases everything. Right. So you gave this great mea culpa. You almost hit all the points. So congratulations on that. Yeah. But then you said, but it's conditional on the gods.
Yeah.
And so then where's the culpability? Where are you assuming that responsibility? And he hasn't.
Okay.
From my point of view.
Yeah, no, that's good. So let me read these 2 lines or 2 sections and then have you talk about the 3 out of the 5 that he got right.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the things he gets really right is book 9, which in Robert Fagel's, it's like line 135, 140. And Agamemnon, lord of men, consented quickly. This is after Diomedes and Nestor give him a proper tongue lashing, right? And in my opinion, he's rather keen to accept it, and he doesn't go ballistic. So that's a win, right? A win. So he says, that's no lie, old man. A full account you give of all my acts of madness. Mad and blind I was. Not even I would or could deny it, right? That's pretty strong right there. So then in line 45 down through, he gives this list of all these things, 12 massive stallions, 10 bars of gold, 7 tripods never touched by fire, 20 burnished cauldrons, racers who earned me. I mean, he lays out this incredible list, including 7 women, flawless, skilled in craft. He lays it all out.
And Briseis.
Okay.
On top of it all.
Yes. But we're dealing with an issue that's too little too late.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So how could he have done it differently in trying to make his apology and make it, even though it's late? Is there something to be said about leadership who doesn't dictate apologies and conditions, but sets down at the table? The one thing he does not say in this list that he will do is bring this to Achilles or sit down and talk to Achilles. Right? To me, that is the fatal flaw in his apology. He's willing to do all the high-handed dictatorial because I can, but he's not willing to look Achilles eye to eye, man to man, and value him as a leader equal. Anything on that?
Well, he clearly has the ability to write the big check. And you know, he thinks the wave of the hand that's going to make it all well is the big check. And that list that you've enunciated is a pretty significant list of things. The problem is it potentially lacks true contrition, right? The awareness that, and whether it's a relational situation that you're in or a leadership situation, the idea of an apology, which is, I'm sorry. Here specifically, I can actually enunciate the 3 things I did. These are the things that I did, whether it was my tone, whether it was the event, whether all of those things. Getting really clear on the specifics of that is when people, and there is a heuristic of apologies. Our brain likes to receive information, especially as it relates to an apology in a certain way. And the first part is that I'm sorry. The second one is specifically, here's what I did. Thirdly, here's how I believe it affected you, which is the opportunity for the person who received the transgression to say, actually, that's not exactly how it affected me. It affected me this way. You see people go offside on their apologies because it said, it seemed like that made you really mad. It's like, no, it actually didn't make me mad. It actually hurt me.
Right.
And that's a very, very different response to the event that happened. And so that's the opportunity for clarification. The third one is, exactly, or the fourth one, whatever one we're on, is this, Here's exactly why it happened. It happened because of my own ego. It happened because I didn't have the prescience to know the events ahead, and therefore I overstepped or I got ahead of my skis. And then the last piece of that is, here's what I'm going to do to ensure that this doesn't happen again. When you get that package like that, you don't need the big check.
Yeah.
That's what people want to hear.
Right. Right. They want to hear that this won't happen again.
Yes.
Because you're changed.
You're changed.
Which the problem with Agamemnon here, and if you get to like line 190, he says, all this I would extend to him if he will end his anger. So for what? 40 lines in this poem, he's saying, I'll give him this. He said, all this he can have, right? But here's the one deal that he's got to sign on to. Let him submit to me completely, which is the problem in the beginning, right? He said, only let me have my way. Yeah. Remember that line? That was what summed up book number 1 to me, right? So he's back in book number 9 saying, okay, if we can kiss and make up here, well, we can get along and go fight this battle. But here's the deal. You have to submit unconditionally to me. So this is like a self-soothing behavior Agamemnon has as a leader. He'll give you anything as long as you give him total blind submission. Right? And so that's a challenge to me as a leader because, Andrew, we all have clay feet. Exactly. I don't care how brazen and gold and our heads are and our breastplates. We all have clay feet. And to demand unconditional loyalty to us as men, it reeks of potential for abuse. It reeks of personality cult. And so this wrap up here, the signature, the postscript is going to defeat the measure completely. And that's why you see in the next 20, 30 lines, Odysseus, Diomedes, they all just walk away because they know you're really not changed, right? And so somehow he could have grown at this point and said, bring other men around me. I've noticed Nestor has really been a voice of reason through this. Let's put together a group of men that will help us collect ourselves here and ensure that this thing doesn't repeat itself. He doesn't do that, right? So it's a self-defeating measure at that point. A lot of leaders do this.
I can't help but wonder if there's a piece before that. Is who... And again, I think all of us as leaders need people to speak into our lives. And we don't see that in this narrative. We don't see anybody that has the liberty. And I think we talked briefly about Machiavelli, the prince. And he says, there's three. You can either have the flatterers or you can have the people that can say anything to you, but neither of those are good choices. You need someone who is a skilled person who can handle, in our case, the word of God well, capable of being able to speak into your life. The best example in that in Scripture is probably Rehoboam, right? So let's go get advice. So he talks to Solomon's old advisors, doesn't like their idea, and goes with the young men, right? And of course, we know how that ends tragically, right? So the choice of who you allow to speak into your life is really, really important. And it doesn't seem like he has somebody that speaks into his life.
Yeah. And what's interesting is if you go over to the Trojan side, and I'm just yanking this out of thin air because we're not going to touch on this book, but Hector, who is the brilliant, he is essentially the Achilles of the Trojan side. He comes up with this great plan, right? We're going to rush headstrong and we're going to do this. And then this guy raises up and says, his name is Polydamas. He said, you're an impossible man. Will you listen to reason? Just because some god exalts you in battle, you think you can beat the rest in tactics too? So he said, you've had a certain measure of success, right? But you can't assume that you know everything in all the sectors, right? So he's saying one man is a splendid fighter, one is a splendid tactician, all of this other stuff, he said, and yet you think you're everything. You're the composite of greatness, right? And so draw back now. This is what Polydamas says to Hector. He says, draw back, call the best of our captains here to this safe ground. Then we can fall in and plan our tactics well, whether we fling ourselves against the ships or beat retreat from the beach and cut our losses. You are stronger because we have spoken. Now, what's brilliant is Hector says, so he urged, his plan won Hector over. Less danger, more success. And down he leapt from his chariot, fully armed, and hit the ground, calling out to Polydamas brisk, winged orders, you stay here, hold back our captains. I'm on my way to hear your words. So there's this perfect example of a listening leader. Right? And at no point could they get Agamemnon to back down. You know,
this idea of moral authority to lead, right? That certainly in a scriptural standpoint, we are given that from God in terms of an anointing, in terms of a mandate. In terms of secular leadership, and there's an overlap in the spiritual world as well, is that moral authority comes from your ability to probably do 4 or 5 things really well. Number one, and I'll use C's because it's easy to remember things that begin with the same letter. So the first one is congruence, that there is full alignment between who you are, what you do, and how you lead. That whatever the situation, whether we're in flight, whether we're in danger, whether we're in success, there's a congruency that I see within your life. Number two, that there is a communication, that you communicate well. And communication, as we always know, is a two-way street. And so you listen as well as you communicate. Number three, that there is a competence in terms of the way. You know, you look at Paul and the way he talks to Timothy, that the person has to be well-trained. The person has to be capable. A workman that's not ashamed, right? That he has all those capabilities. So he has that competence. The continuance, the ability to actually sustain it over the long term. We see this with Agamemnon, that he's a little bit flighty, like he's really good, not so good, really good, not so good. And when you lose that continuity, when people recognize that in your leadership, you begin to lose some of that moral authority to lead. And then the last one is probably just compassion, the ability to bring those people that are under you in your care, to bring them forward with compassion. And so those things are what represents the base mark of trust, is that in order to have the moral authority to lead, you have to have trust, or you have to be trustworthy. And you develop trustworthiness by having those attributes. And he lacks that, or he's irregular at best in these items.
Yeah. It's interesting because even when he does well, he does it to the degree that he lets Nestor speak to him. Mm-hmm. But he never empowers Nestor to make a decision based on their good communication. Mm-hmm. Like, I see that as a continuing kind of tragedy in this whole story, is him and Nestor will have these brilliant communications, and you're like, now we're getting somewhere. And then he tells Nestor, all right, back to your tent. And then he goes away and he just is Agamemnon. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Achilles gets this list, and he basically says to Nestor and Diomedes, and I love this line, he says, what a grief it will be to you through all these years to come. No remedy, no way to change or cure the damage once it's done, right? So he basically sees this, and Achilles says, you can tell King Agamemnon, take his gifts and go sail away. And he basically says, there's no way I'm going to receive this, okay? Which brings me to Deuteronomy 16 and 19, which says, a gift blinds the eyes of the wise, but it doesn't blind the eyes of the offended. So it apparently blinded Nestor to think this may work, but we fail to see how offense works. Achilles is so offended at this point that he's blind even to the gifts, you know.
Proverbs 18:19, right? A brother offended is pretty hard to get back.
Yeah.
And you know, are they brothers? In some ways, you know, we could talk about the hierarchy, and I think you set that up a little bit at the beginning in previous conversations. Is that there was, you know, Agamemnon might have been the king of kings, so to speak, but they were all in their own right kings, and so there is a relationship there, a lateral relationship between them, and so this idea that a brother that is offended is harder to win than a city.
Yeah.
And that's what he is faced with.
Yeah. And so the very idea when someone is offended and they're wanting to be valued in the sense of guaranteeing that I'm not going to do this to you again, number one. Number two, that you deserve better than the way I handled this, right? The whole concept of gifts is almost an offense on top of an offense, right? And so Achilles says, his gifts, I loathe his gifts. I wouldn't give you a splinter for that man if he gave me 10 or 20 times over or possesses all to give the world if he cannot give me respect.
Yeah.
And isn't that fundamentally what leaders forget to give? So last time you gave a lot of good information and great insight on motivators and how to incentivize. But we fail sometimes to see that the greatest incentivization is respect and mutual respect, you know. And that's what you see here. He says, no wealth is worth my life. So Achilles goes back to the idea that this is not going to work. This whole war is unjust. And if I gained all these prizes, is it worth me giving my life? So now you have Achilles looking at the long term and Agamemnon wanting a short-term victory. How do you balance out when you're somebody who sees further than your leader?
So this brings up the topic of leading up, right? Is how do we lead up? And really, to me, what leading up is, in the most simplistic form, is this idea of communicating to your leader, the person that has you in their care, what it is that makes you most alive, where you have the best skill, what respect looks like, how you learn, how you want to be rewarded. All of us as leaders, if I gave a leader a list of, okay, the 5 people in your care, tell me how they learn, tell me what they value, so how do you reward them, tell me where their greatest skill is, right? These are questions that every leader should have top of mind for those people that are in their care.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, Agamemnon has a mental model that says it's all about the booty. It's all about the trinkets in the trash, the stuff that we can bring home.
Right.
And as a result, he has lost, back to that, he has lost the moral authority to lead. And you see in Achilles, he says, you know, why, pray, must the Argives even fight? Like, they've even lost sense of what the purpose is at this stage of the game.
Yeah.
So they're completely displaced from the reason why we're even here.
Yeah. And do you think that's because to Agamemnon it was just the prize, the money, the material, and he didn't see the purpose and the cause?
Exactly. People will do good work for money. They'll do better work for a person. They'll do their best work for a person. And he is not for a purpose. They'll do their best work for a purpose. He has done a poor job of articulating that for those that are part of this whole endeavor.
Okay. So we have plenty of time right now to get into this.
Okay.
And this is what I'm interested to pick your brain on. The embassy concept here. They get a group of men that are bought into the cause. They get a group of, for lack of a better word, Andrew, interventionists.
Right.
To say, okay, if we can't talk sense into this side, let's go to this side and see if we can get him to raise to the cause, right? And so they go and they're appealing to Agamemnon and they're appealing to Achilles. Can we, for the sake of the greater good, put this behind us? At what point does someone who is aggrieved become so moved by their desire to communicate that they get somebody else and involve a group effort in trying to restore a sense of equilibrium? And how does that work, especially as it relates to the kingdom?
Well, as you're fond of saying, and I think it's so apropos, is, there is a formula in Matthew 18 that gives us that understanding. What we don't see is the specifics on the timeline. Is it, at what point do you bring a second? Well, we know if they don't hear you, then you bring a second. But what are all the other triggers in terms of getting that? And I think that's the opportunity for discussion. I think everyone has to look at that, individually as to what that feels like for them.
So they go to him and they come together and they start pleading with him. Will you fight? Right? And so they have to tell him, they have to take sides in a sense. Agamemnon may or may not be right at this point. Achilles, you may have had the high moral ground, but you're squandering it through petulance, right? So Andrew Bentley is going right now down to the tents between the ships to talk to Achilles. What do you say to get this guy to see the loss of friendship, camaraderie, the loss of community? He's lonely. He says 4 times, this has stolen more than the girl. It stole my friends, right? What do you say to Achilles to get him to shake out of where he's at and see what he's doing?
Well, I can tell you what I don't say.
Okay.
This isn't about will you go fight. And I think, the error of, let's just put all that behind us. Let's get back in the fight. Let's go. The fight isn't the problem. He's got lots of fight in him. He's a capable warrior. The problem is he has been so offended. I think there's a great book for people who are experience some of this, not abandonment is the wrong word, but some of this cognitive dissonance, this misconnecting with their leader. The Tale of Three Kings. Don't know if you've ever seen or heard.
Edwards.
Yeah, exactly. Fabulous book on what is my responsibility? In the Three Kings, we have Saul, we have David, and we have Absalom. And Saul thinks everybody looks like Absalom, and Absalom thinks everybody's a Saul. And the only guy that's sort of navigating the waters appropriately is David, because David's learned how to dodge spears. He's learned how to look introspectively. He's learned in his own leadership what submission looks like. And so there's a lot there we can talk about. But my appeal to Achilles is not the battle. It's not what we could do together. It's not all of that. We've got to talk about Achilles. We've got to talk about what's going on with Achilles. We need to talk about the hurt. We need to talk, and it's a question I've used when I'm coaching people that are particularly worked up. Question I ask them as I say, what principle or value has been offended? So, I'm just so mad at this. There's such, okay, tell me what principle, what value is it specifically that has been offended in you? And tell me how you live that value. So we get into a really good and interesting conversation about, so if it's about respect, well, tell me about how you live respect. Tell me how you express respect. What does an expression of respect look like? And we start doing a bunch of introspective work to say, what is the problem? Where have you been offended? What value or principle has been offended for you? And let's start doing some work on Achilles. That's where I think the work has to happen, not trying to get him back in the battle.
Yeah. And do you try to make him emotionally aware of what he's doing and where he's at? Is that part of his own regenerative story? Is there redemption for him as well in this?
Absolutely. I mean, he's not without fault entirely in this. Like,
Right.
there is a, whether you call it a leadership maturity, whatever words we want to use, he has fallen very quickly into this sort of self-indulgent pity party.
Yep.
And he's not easily coming out of that. And there's good reason for that. But as a leader, he's got to ask himself, how did I find myself here? Where did my sense of compassion go? Where did my sense of forgiveness go? And there's a lot we could talk about forgiveness and what triggers forgiveness. But he clearly is operating not as a leader and not, quite frankly, as a very good follower.
Right.
Right? A follower, you think about sort of the ingredients of a really good follower. One of the ingredients, I would say, is loyalty. And I talk about that oftentimes as maybe one of the first ingredients, this idea of loyalty. And it's not a blind loyalty, because we all understand, to your point, that we have feet of clay and our leaders have feet of clay. But it's an understanding of that they have foibles, and that my job when I experience those foibles is to give them clarity around it, to have conversation around it, and to lead up related to that so that the relationship can go on. And Achilles has, in my view, done a terrible job of doing that.
Yeah. So, and you think about what Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And then the thing that we're toying with here in this book is that you blame everybody else but for what they're guilty of, which is actually a good projection of what you're wrestling with.
Yes.
So he's screaming out that Agamemnon only cares about the prize, but he's willing to hazard everything for the loss of what
The prize.
should have been a nominal impact on his life.
Yes.
Right? And one of the things that bothers me about Achilles is, and this, I'm sensitive to this as a leader, I'm sensitive to this in myself and in other people, is unreasonableness. Anything, if there's anything that makes me run to the hills from people, it is a sense of unreasonable. Now, like I said, we all have feet of clay, right? But if you can get those people with feet of clay to sit down and talk, then you can say, okay, I'm going to ignore the clay and the crumble down there, and I'm going to appreciate the gold, the brass, whatever I can get out of, the other parts. But Achilles loses all sense of reasonableness. So I think in King James Version, it uses the word implacable, which means unapproachable or unreasonable. So God deliver us from unreasonable, ungodly, and unreasonable men. You know, Andrew, I found that those two characteristics go hand in hand. Unreasonable and ungodly are normally very close associates. Most people that are reasonable, even if they do something ungodly, they will wind up landing on godliness because they're reasonable. Okay? Listen to what Diomedes says in line number 600 in Fagel's translation. So you, Achilles, great and godlike Achilles, I made you a son, I tried, so someday you might fight disaster off my back. But now, Achilles, beat down your mounting fury. It's wrong to have such an iron and ruthless heart. Even the gods themselves can bend and change, and theirs is the greater power, honor, and strength. Even the gods, I say, with incense, soothing vows, with full cups poured, and deep and smoky savor, men bring them round, begging for pardon when one oversteps the mark. How are you, vain to this voice of prayer for forgiveness? Come, even the gods can be placated. Who do you think you are? You know, and this is so amazing to me, because you read Isaiah, and I know they're pantheistic here, but you read Isaiah and they're getting these attributions of God-likeness from what they've seen the God, one true God, do. And Isaiah 1 says, "Come now, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, I'll make them white as snow." So here you have obvious guilt, appropriation of guilt. Your sins are like scarlet, bright as red, right? If you will come, I will reason with you. The penultimate stress there is you're going to be clean. That's the stress. But the penultimate stress is you're going to be clean because I will reason with you. If I'm unreasonable, you die in your sins, right? So here's this window into Achilles' real problem is that he is so self-righteous and high on his horse that he don't even have to reason with anyone, even his own friends. That's scary to me.
Absolutely.
As a leader, how can one facilitate a more reasonable conversation and approach to leadership? I'm sure you've seen even some secular, illustrations of people who did or didn't follow the path of reasonability, and what was the outcome of that?
I mean, it always ends in some form of destruction. There's this. For me, it comes back to this again. This idea of are there people that can speak into my life? That if I can't be told anything, even as a leader, how is it possible for me to lead people with compassion? And so we see it, in secularism, where people who have big egos, they believe their own publicity. And as long as you keep believing your own publicity, you're destined to fall. I can't remember the author's name, but ego is the enemy, right? It is absolutely the enemy. I think all of us have to recognize that what we have and what we've achieved has been through God. Right. I have nothing of myself. I'm broken without him. All things are by him and through him. And as we know, everything was made through him. But even me as a leader, I am by him and through him. Except the grace of God appear in my life, then I can't lead effectively.
Right.
He has no sense of that, it seems.
Yeah, I would agree. Is there some wrap-up thoughts, some things that you want to touch on through this book 9 that we could tease out, or that you could at least put in the mind of the listeners, so if they go to read book 9 of the Iliad, they at least have that to anchor some thought around?
I would say it goes back to, and it's going to be a bit of a repeat, but it does go back to, how do I hear people within my life? We talked about this idea that there are soloists in your leadership, the people that go off and they do their thing. Mm-hmm. There are those who are challengers, and they have great ideas, but boy, they sometimes challenge you, and they're changing directions a lot, but they have a point of view, and they have high engagement, and they have high value to the organization. And you got to figure out how to hear from the challengers. You got to figure out how to hear from the soloists. They have high value to the organization, but sometimes their engagement. And there are cynics, and even cynics have value to an organization, because at least they're listening, at least they're paying attention, at least they're aware enough to see where the opportunities are for improvement. And so I listen to cynics. The one I probably have the most problem with are those that are apathetic. They have low value to the organization, and they have low engagement.
Yeah.
And I find it very challenging to listen to those people. So happy to hear the soloists, happy to hear the challengers, happy to even hear the cynics. But the apathetic, those are the ones that I struggle with most. And so for me, the theme is, listen to people, listen to concerns. It doesn't challenge your leadership. It doesn't challenge your authority. There was a great quote, I wrote it down in the Three Kings, which basically is that rules, that men who speak endlessly of authority only prove that they have none.
Yes.
And that they're made to allow them to go to bed early, is how he says it. And so, again, I worry about people that don't have voices in their life. I think that's the message I would leave in terms of conclusion.
That's very good. That's very, very good. I've often said that saints, very few saints have a real problem with authority. I think you get in Pentecost and we don't want weak, anemic leadership. We want strong leaders, right? And I think people appreciate that someone has authority. They just probably don't want to hear about it every Wednesday night. You know what I'm saying? So, it is a balance here. Yeah. And you can see that it is, Achilles primarily cares about how offended he is, and Agamemnon primarily cares about his authority. Can I take it just because I'm testing you and I can take it? Both are wrong, and both of them fall to pretty low places.
And both are projecting themselves on the situation.
Yes. Yes, and it's interesting because it's like Saul when David was running from him and he went out, and then Jonathan comes in. He says, I know where David is. And he says exactly the thing that he assumes because it's the darkness of his own heart being projected. Mm-hmm. We see in others what we're afraid others will see in us. Yeah. And so if I see it in you first, then I beat you to the draw. It's the okay corral, right? And you don't see me, right? And so I live to fight and hide another day. And that's what you see in these leaders. And it's so pitiful because book 9 really becomes the point of no return for both of them. And now Agamemnon slowly, just his leadership dissipates and dies this natural death, which is worse than dying on the battlefield, being beheaded, is to be ignored. Like, there's no worse punishment for a leader than to be ignored, right? You'd rather be an overthrow or a coup or something. But don't just let me die by ignoring me for the next 30 years kind of thing. But it's going to, the same with Achilles. He starts trying to do things, but now he's going to do it out of guilt. What he's done up to this point is offense, but now he's going to lead by guilt. And it's half measures, and we both loathe mediocrity, right?
Yes.
So this next episode will be fun. Okay, check back in the next time with us, and we'll do episode number 5 on Homeric leadership and a few choice things that we're picking out of it.